Perfect. So, hello everyone. Welcome to this event on the future of devolution. We'll be discussing the future of devolution and the new paper that's been released by Centre that's going to be released soon. First of all, just a couple of housekeeping rules. We'll have a question and answer session during the second half of the event once we've got through my questions. If you'd like to ask a question then, you can either write it in the chat now or raise your hand either physically or virtually at the end. So whilst members of the audience and members of the panel are speaking, we'd also ask that you could mute your microphones during that bit. I'm pleased to be able to announce that our panel includes Lord Kinnock, who served as leader of the opposition and leader of the Labour Party from 1983 to 1992, Vice President of the European Commission from 1999 to 2004, currently a member of the House of Lords and one of the finest orators and politicians that this country has ever produced. Probably more my opinion than necessarily Centre's. We're also joined by Suzy Davies, former member of the Senedd between 2011 and 2021. Suzy ran to be leader of the Welsh Conservatives in 2018 and was the first woman to do so. We're also joined by Andrew George, who's a member of Parliament for St Ives between 1997 and 2015. He's currently a councillor in Cornwall. And we're also joined, last but certainly not least, Patrick English, the Associate Director in the Political and Social Research team at YouGov, and he was also their spokesperson on political research. So with the introductions out of the way, let's get on with the questions. And the first question I'd like to put is to you, Neil. On balance, do you think devolution has benefited the UK?
In one sense, I feel a bit like Chu Enlai when he was asked what he thought the effect of the French Revolution was. He said, it's too early to say. And I guess that after just less than a quarter of a century, it still is too early to say. But in summary, I guess in terms of identity and development of identity, and in terms of some social policy developments, the answer is that there have been benefits to devolution. However, it has to be said that in material terms, for the people of Wales and Scotland, in terms of their living standards and opportunities, and also in terms of the taunt of taxation powers, the answer has to be no, it hasn't benefited Scotland and Wales. There's been no significant advance in living standards or sense of material security. And in addition, of course, the idea of taxation powers, I know we're coming to that later, for the devolved parliaments is superficial window dressing, simply because neither country is going to put itself at a competitive disadvantage with the rest of the United Kingdom. And in any case, so far as Wales is concerned, there aren't sufficient numbers of high incomes or high value assets to enable a higher level of taxation on those who otherwise can afford to pay. So socially, and in some senses politically, yes, there's been benefits. In material terms, in economic terms, in terms of real exercise of powers, since both parliaments have been chronically underfunded, the answer is no.
The same question to you, Patrick. On balance, do you think devolution has benefited the UK?
Well, I think the answer to that question depends, perhaps to build on the previous answer. What do we measure success on? And speaking with my sort of YouGov hat on, should we look to see, are the public happy with their devolved powers in the areas where they have these? Mostly yes. So if we look at the Scottish Parliament, there's generally a sense that the Scottish Parliament among Scottish people is a good thing, that has done good things, and they're quite happy with the institution there. We can also look at some examples of metro mayors, for example, Manchester, a very popular metro mayor there, and a general sense that that model of devolution has worked for the people of Manchester and Greater Manchester, but sometimes no. Police and crime commissioners are an example of a devolved power that people didn't want and still don't like and still don't turn out to vote for. And also we see very decreasing turnout rates the more devolved you see the power. For example, sort of regional parliaments don't get the same amount of turnout as a general election, local authority elections don't get the same as regional powers, and police and crime commissioners don't get anywhere near the local turnouts either. So it depends how you measure success, and it depends, I think, how you measure what people are looking for and what things they are concerned about when they want devolution. There's also a significant constituency of people, more so in Wales than in Scotland and Northern Ireland, who want their devolved parliaments abolished entirely. So if older people, males, people with sort of less political attention, tend to be sort of leaning toward the idea almost that they should get rid of the parliaments entirely. And indeed, there have been, let's say semi-successful campaigns and parties in Wales who got elected to the Senedd to do exactly that. So I certainly think that overall, perhaps, yes, the public are seeing devolution and the instance of devolution across the United Kingdom as successful, but that's by no means uniform. I think there's different ways we can look at it and cut the cake. And then there's the other question of has devolution been successful for the United Kingdom in terms of the Union? Well, the recent experience of Scotland might suggest perhaps you could make arguments to say that, well, the devolution there, in the sense of giving the SNP more power, giving Scotland more authority, has kind of got rid of the idea that Scotland couldn't govern itself. And so therefore you might make the argument from a unionist perspective that devolution has been harmful there. So therefore no surprises there to see a lot of sort of pro-unionist support going behind parties or movements that might want to get rid of these institutions. But that said, I think probably overall, if we were to ask the public, has devolution been successful, I think they probably would say yes.
Mm-hmm. During the Brexit negotiations, we saw a large split between Westminster and devolved legislatures in their preferences for our relationship with the EU and how powers should be devolved. Are there any measures that can be put in place to prevent these issues from occurring in the future? Suzy, what do you think?
Yeah, it was an interesting time, wasn't it? And I happened to be in the Senedd when all that was going on. I think what it revealed that period was the limit of structures and the danger of vacuums turning into party political opportunities. And of course, the benefit of soft diplomacy, which was such an instrument in the European Union itself, has been an awful lot of work got done on the basis of people speaking to each other rather than institutions speaking to each other. And I think we missed an opportunity with the 2017 Wales Act. I suspect it was a deliberately missed opportunity to describe, considering that this was after the 2016 referendum, to describe what reserved powers, which related to things like foreign affairs, actually meant as regards the European Union. And as a result of that, of course, it's left plenty of space for parties to, and in fact individuals, to argue that there was a legislative intent that perhaps wasn't there. I think what was clear from that act, though, is that from the point of view of sovereignty, it did preserve the UK parliamentary sovereignty, but subsequent events have shown that actually it doesn't matter how much of a purist you are, we're not going to actually get devolution at any level working within the UK unless there's recognition of de facto shared sovereignty. And that's why structures are still pretty important in how we might deal with that. So, I mean, I'm not one for reinventing the wheel. So, we can look at things like the joint ministerial committees, which didn't function particularly well during the actual Brexit process, partly because of pressures all over the place. The speed at which people or institutions being asked to deal with the unknitting of our membership of the European Union caused huge problems. But I think that was exacerbated by slightly chaotic, if I can put it like that, dealing of those agendas by the UK government. But then I think that was exacerbated itself by, well, I'm going to just characterise it as whinging, to be quite honest, because here in Wales anyway, because so much political time was taken up in committees and in the chamber of the Senedd, just sort of everybody saying that the UK government were bad, and I'm sure the same was happening in Westminster, when actually effort should have been focused into finding the relationships that would have progressed the work in those particular committee structures. So yeah, the long and short of it is, yes, use what we've got with the joint ministerial committees to make sure that that's better embedded in legislation. It needs to deal with the issue of the Sewell Convention, which I'm guessing members on this call are familiar with, and to actually understand that personalities really matter in this. And one of the difficulties, I guess, with devolution is it creates quite a lot of small bodies of people, and if they're not willing to work together towards the common goal for political advantage in other directions, then devolution is absolutely not going to work. And as somebody who went out and campaigned for it in 1979, I'd be really, really disappointed. I'm a bit disappointed with it already, if I'm honest, but nevertheless, I don't particularly want it to disappear down the plug hole either.
The same question to you, Neil. Because of the split that occurred during the Brexit negotiations, do you think that there are any measures that can be put in place to prevent the issues that were caused by those splits between the different legislatures from occurring in the future?
In one sense, no, because we're not going to have another referendum, certainly not in similar circumstances. If the question was, should instruments, policies, activities be put in place, I'd say yes, and they could be. Of course, I find myself in broad agreement with what Suzy just said, that there are mechanisms that theoretically exist for promoting greater cohesion in policy development and application between Westminster and the devolved parliaments. But of course, they're gathering dust. The joint ministerial committees meet about as often as I run a 4-minute mile. And the whole apparatus fell into near disuse. Secondly, and vitally, there was a promise in 2019 in the general election, in manifesto, Conservative manifesto. Sorry, saying Conservative has that effect on me. Sorry, it's asthma, not COVID. There was a manifesto promise and statements that Wales would get not a penny less as a consequence of movement out of the European Union and, of course, detachment from the Regional Development Fund and the Social Fund. The result that we see nearly 4 years later is that Wales has lost £560 million in the levelling up funding by comparison with what was budgeted specifically for the 20 to 25 European Union budget. So whilst there could be repair of a disused apparatus, and while there could be a proper implementation of a solemn pledge made during an election, neither is actually happening yet. And if we're going to make devolution work, even just in Wales and Scotland, then of course, centrally, there must be an entirely different ideological and political attitude towards decentralization and devolution. Until that happens, we are going to get continued divergence, not just on the issue of relationships with the European Union, but on many other things between Scotland and Wales and Whitehall and Westminster.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There are multiple areas within the UK, including Cornwall and Yorkshire, that have active campaigns calling for their own assemblies. What do these campaigns need to do if they are to gain public support or indeed gain more public support? Andrew, what are your thoughts on that question?
Well, I don't know about other areas, but certainly in Cornwall, the primary aim is to continue galvanising local support. I don't think there's an issue there. The issue really is to do what we can to ensure that there's fertile ground in Westminster that properly understands that devolution is about letting go rather than clinging on for dear life to powers in Westminster. I mean, one of the big problems I think we had in the past, I remember the referendum in the northeast of England when that was being kind of hatched together by the then Labour government. I think, you know, there was good intentions, and on the back of devolution to Wales and Scotland, there was a potential momentum there. But the problem was that in the case of Scotland and Wales, though that devolution emanated from those two nations, and the problem with the way in which the government then attempted to implement devolution in the northeast is that it was very much Westminster going up to the northeast and saying, here you are, here's your boundaries, here's your power, here's the referendum. Now, do you want this or not? And there was no kind of sense in the dynamic of the way it was being put together that it was emanating from the place itself. And one of the biggest problems, I think, has been that there's a sense in government, and Westminster always falls into this. In its kind of rather narrow view of how this should be done, that they draw lines on maps, and they assume that in drawing those lines on the map, these then suddenly become regions with their own internal integrity and sense of community, when in fact, actually, they are merely government zones. So when Cornwall was lumped into the government zone of the southwest, and the government ministers were referring to it as a region, I had to constantly say, well, it's not really a region in the sense that it has internal integrity or any kind of sense. It's purely been created for administrative convenience. It is the government zone of the southwest. It's not our zone. You know, I've no disrespect to the other places within the so-called southwest, but Cornwall doesn't have the same identity. We have as much as identity and relationship and favour with Yorkshire or as much as we have with Gloucestershire. There's no sense that we're part of the same sort of entity. So I think it's getting the Westminster end right. I think we know in Cornwall what we can do and why we're doing it, but the narrative just isn't there. The other end, it's like a dialogue of the deaf, really, talking to people at that end. They don't understand.
Mm-hmm. Patrick, yeah, no, of course.
Andrew makes really valid points, and the central one is decentralization, devolution must not be an act mentally or politically of condescension. Mm-hmm. You can't reduce or reform or modernize centralization by having people at the center, as Andrew puts it, drawing lines on maps. There's mm-hmm. got to be some innate requirement for an improvement of governance, mm-hmm. among which is a requirement for provincial, regional, national, whatever we want to call it, representation and administration. Now, I actually think that demand exists, but it's incoherent. And the demand exists not so much to hold up flags over Cornwall or Dorset or Yorkshire or Leicestershire. I think the demand exists in the form of resistance to and resentment against over-centralization. And that's what's got to be focused on. Britain is manifestly hugely over-centralized. And I made the argument back in 1979 that if devolution was a good idea for Scotland and Wales, it was a good idea for everybody, because decentralization in an over-centralized state recommends itself. And it's one of the reasons why I led the no campaign back in the 79 referendum. But things have moved on. Attitudes have developed. The argument for decentralization is stronger, and the sentiment in favor of it is stronger. That's what Westminster and Whitehall have somehow got to get hold of. Otherwise, we'll see the fracturing of the UK and a hell of a lot of discontent and economic underperformance.
Absolutely. Just to turn to that same question, to you, Patrick. I mean, what do you think that these campaigns need to do if they're able to gain more public support in Cornwall and Yorkshire and in other areas that seek a devolution settlement?
Well, with full respect to my esteemed fellow panelists, people aren't too keen in general on politicians, and so
Right.
any sort of argument or any campaign that goes to people and say what we think you need is more politicians is going to start from quite a difficult base, I think, in terms of public opinion and gathering public support. So, but that's not to say that it can't be successful. Indeed, we've had a lot of success stories that we can look around the various parts of the UK, and perhaps if movements were interested in building such movements in their own areas, learn from. And I think the two key things which you look across the common areas where devolution has been successful and public support has sort of been guarded behind it, one is building a sense of identity. So we look at Scotland, Wales, Manchester, London, clear instances where there's some kind of communal identity, some kind of, and this perhaps goes to the drawing lines on maps argument against that, right? It's an idea that there is some sort of community there, something that you can build an identity around and build an electoral unit around. That seems to be a common story of success for all the sort of devolved areas where devolution looks like it's working. A second one is to sort of go back to my opening point, is you have to convince the public that the trade-off between more politicians and more politics in your life, which people generally are going to be quite set against, is getting better decisions, getting more accountability, and is worth it. And I think key examples there within England might be Manchester and Tees Valley, where people can see concrete things happening, quite high-profile individuals going out, going to Westminster, going to other regions, making the case for their people, their identity, and what they want and need. And so I think looking at the Metro Mayor example a bit more closely, the funding, I think, is also another interesting element, particularly winning new funding. I think if you can go to local publics and say, well, you know, okay, you might have to have some more politicians, but look at all this stuff we're getting out of Westminster that we're going to get to spend right here on things that you care about, and you can hold us accountable for that. So if people get a sense that they're getting a really good deal out of the politicians far away to get more stuff here for them, I think that trade-off and that balance and that idea of, look, you do need more politicians, you do need more politics, you need more things to vote for, that argument becomes a lot easier. And then I think you probably see a bit more of a swell of public support in these areas that are trying to get devolved settlements right now.
Mm-hmm. And I think we've touched on this point a little bit already, but devolution within England and Cornwall is currently far behind devolution in the rest of the UK. Andrew, do you think that England is likely to see further devolution in the future? And do you feel that there is enough support to make it happen? Do you think it's going to take a while to build up that extra public support?
Well, I mean, I first of all just wanted to say that I agree with what Patrick is saying. It's like he's adding a further dimension to the point that I think I was making earlier. I'm not suggesting that people want to see more politicians or politics. I think they want to see that their identities are reflected and that their lives are improved. But I think I also think that the Andy Burnham, the Manchester Metro Mayor, is a good example of where this is working, and perhaps, but I'm not sure it's properly understood. Again, I think the problem is that the Whitehall Westminster end. I mean, at the moment in Cornwall, for example, we're faced with and we've had a consultation on, and we'll no doubt make a decision about whether what's known as a devolution deal is going to be acceptable to Cornwall. I mean, it's built on. I don't want to get you drawn into the parochial issues of Cornwall, but it's built on a misunderstanding of why the Metro Mayor in Manchester is a success, which is the bringing together of a number of boroughs and actually placing a mayor on top of a single unitary authority runs the risk of simply adding, a megalomaniac on top of a dysfunctional local authority, and also it's built on it's being missold as Neil will understand. We're told that there's 30 years of funding going forward, and they've conflated this to £360 million. Well, that was last week, and then it's now apparently grown to £400 million over X period of time. But of course, as we know, no government can bind the hands of its successors. So what they've done is created, a magic money tree, but also within the document itself, they have it's very clear that this is about central control. In fact, it's not a devolution deal, it's a devolution delusion, that in fact the only way in which this megalomaniac, or perhaps they might be a great leader, would be able to get their plans through is that ministers have to sign it off, and that they have to keep going back to ministers to have it approved, and those plans reformed. So in fact, actually, it's not a devolution deal; it's a centralisation deal, and it gives the local authority less say in its future. So I think it needs to, the problem is that I think the culture in Westminster just doesn't understand what devolution is about. And so if we're going to do it, and we're going to build on the successes, I think it's a success, in spite of what Neil was saying earlier, of Wales and Scotland, and indeed Manchester. I think we need to understand why, and we need to understand that it's, as I've said earlier, it's about letting go rather than clinging on to power in Westminster, and allowing communities, or identities, territories. In the case of Cornwall, we do see ourselves as quite different. Me and Advinda Castle says we do have our own language. Not many people speak it these days as they do in Wales, but it is a place with quite distinctive identities and reasons why we need to build on those strengths to make the place work.
Mm-hmm. The same question to you, Patrick. Do you think that England is likely to see further devolution in the future, and do you feel that there is enough support to make it happen?
In short, not if it requires public consent. So we track public support for devolution in England very regularly, and our most recent poll found 29% were in favour of the idea of an English Parliament. The most popular answer was don't know, at 45%. So this is still something that people don't really think about too much. It's not really at the top of their political agenda, and particularly if we're thinking about the terms of the trade-offs in the court of public opinion, they'd rather see money come into their pockets to pay bills coming through their doors than they would a devolution settlement. We can also look at some recent referenda for some clues. So in 2012, 9 cities rejected the idea of a directly elected mayor. So it's sort of in the ballot box as well, we see struggles for greater devolution being passed down, greater power being passed down for communities. However, that said, broadly speaking, decisions being made more locally and closer to the people to whom it concerns is a popular concept. And the idea of accountability and being able to see clear lines of money coming through, things happening and results being improved is a popular suggestion. So I think if it's framed in those ways and those arguments are won on those terms, then I think that picture does change. But for now, I think a lot of the public and a lot of the arguments that are filtering through to the public seem to be about having more politics in your life, which is a sort of touch on the previous answer, isn't a hugely popular thing to suggest to the average voter. I think perhaps it'd be more likely that we see settlements made between local authorities and governments to get more power or sort of funding in exchange for more perhaps overarching accountability mechanisms, including perhaps more metro mayors, and perhaps in future they might evolve into something that's shaped a little bit more like a London Assembly or more like the authority that's going on there. But for now, I think it's a long road, and those perhaps sort of power changing and exchanging between various levels of government is more likely than the establishment of something completely new and sort of with public backing in the short term, at least.
Mm-hmm. The Welsh and
simply to say that the way in which metro mayors have developed anarchically, really, there's been no cogency to the whole approach. But the metro mayors can run head-on into the real idea of effective and meaningful devolution, decentralization, because in some respects, of course, as has already been pointed out, they are centralizing influences. And the consequence of all this is you can get more government without necessarily getting better government. And you can get more powers of some kind without necessarily getting the money to make those powers meaningful. So my argument is for a proper constitutional strategy for decentralization of governance so that the regions and nations of the United Kingdom are more able to get proximity of government and greater accountability of government, which should increase efficiency and transparency of government. All we have to do is to look at other comparable models of countries at a similar stage of development and ask ourselves, are they better governed than we are? And the answer to that is yes.
On that issue of accountability, the Welsh and the Scottish Parliaments have only limited powers to change income tax rates. Neil, do you think that Westminster should expand the taxation powers of the devolved bodies? And do you think that there is any public support for this?
It is meaningless. I mean, the powers exist, and some people celebrated when they were extended to Wales a few years ago. But the reality is that neither Wales nor Scotland are going to put themselves deliberately at a competitive disadvantage with the remainder of the United Kingdom. That's the first thing. So they're being given a power that they can't really exercise to any significant extent. Secondly, while things are slightly different in Scotland in terms of the generality of the spread of incomes, in Wales, there is simply not enough high incomes or wealthy assets to make for an effective higher tax base. So I used the phrase earlier, taxation powers in current circumstances are a taunt, not least, of course, because across England, there's been no revaluation of properties for council tax purposes since the early 1990s, while housing values, prices have been transformed. So this is further evidence of hypocrisy at the centre, false celebration in Scotland and Wales, and a source of chronic underfunding in the industrial transition areas, I'll use a polite term, of England. And that's why I describe the whole thing as a bloody mess that needs to be sorted out with substantial constitutional reform. Taxation powers in the current circumstances don't really mean a damn.
Suzy, the same question to you. Do you think that Westminster should expand the taxation powers?
Well, your question was originally about income tax powers, and I've got some sympathy with what Neil was saying there, because, you know, turkeys for Christmas, etc. But, you know, Scotland does have a slightly higher rate of income tax, which doesn't seem to have been to the detriment of their competition in the end. So it's a question of small margins on that, I think. But it's more to do, I think, with the words income tax. Everybody kind of understands what that is. People generally have had some sort of experience with it. And I think there's some genuine peril here for the Labour Party in particular, because it's going to be their voters. Nobody wants extra taxes particularly, but if it's a choice between Keir Starmer saying no to taxes and Mark Drakeford saying yes to them, it creates some tensions there, which I suspect the party thinks are completely unnecessary, because they're not really going to be introducing income tax raises anyway. What's happening, of course, instead is that other taxation powers are being used with some success, particularly in areas of the economy where there's no particular political peril for the Labour Party. So, you know, I've got a background in tourism, and that is well up for being sort of scraped out of any profitability at the moment. And again, that's happening with very limited scrutiny, because we've got this cooperation agreement in Wales at the moment where tourism is up for grabs as far as both parties are concerned. So I don't think it doesn't come without it's not just talk. It can have an impact, tax varying powers or new tax rating power. But just to speak specifically about income tax, I've got two major objections. One is obviously the Barnett formula absolutely needs reform at the moment.
Yes.
But we have had a government in power for the last 25 years that has, well, no, I'll concentrate my argument into one effectively, which is We've had an enormous amount of European money over the last 20 years or so, ourselves and Cornwall, of course. There are other post-industrial areas of the UK that either haven't had that money or have had it and then didn't get it because they were improving. And I think this is going to be the major objection to any kind of proper tax raising powers in Wales, because if Wales, after 20 odd years of having all that extra euro money, is still at the bottom of all the major indicators, as Neil mentioned in the opening question, really, there's going to be no confidence that this particular government is going to be able to spend any taxation well. And I suspect that'll be an impression across parties, effectively, because it would be lovely to think we could be Scandinavia, where we have high taxation and greater equality, effectively. But I think it might have been Patrick who mentioned it. We want individuals like to get their own house in order before they become generous with whatever money they've got left over, effectively. And I don't know whether that's because of people's life experiences or whether it's a deep culture that we have here in Wales. Actually, switching us to become a Scandinavia, I think, is going to take generations. And what we've had in the period of devolution, as we what this discussion about, has not encouraged us to take those risks when we see governments of all flavours wasting money hand over fist without any apparent advantage, specifically in Wales.
Now we're going to come on to the Q&A section of the discussion. We've got a question here from Alexander Rose. Alexander asks, how should the government check that public money is being administered properly by devolved bodies? And what should the sanction be where sums are not spent in line with the relevant laws? Should money be recovered by central government? Who would like to respond to that question first?
Well, in both cases, in Scotland and Wales, and indeed across the United Kingdom, there's a National Audit Office. The problem with the National Audit Office is not its expertise or its independence, both of which are excellent, but by definition, the fact that they investigate after the event more than during the expenditure, and their conclusions can be partially implemented or neglected. So we need a strengthening of the audit function on a national basis, but also in terms of local government, as well as devolution. That's much the best way to do it. I introduced an auditing system in the European Commission, and the result is much greater efficiency, and it's been, I don't know, 18, 19 years since there was the merest whiff of scandal, simply because there's an effective means now of measuring every input and every output in expenditure terms. When we can modernize that operation in the United Kingdom, when we've got the expertise, we certainly have, then we'll see more efficiency as well as accountability and better management in the use of public money.
Andrew, what's your response to the question?
Well, I think it's kind of contrary to the whole principles of devolution, isn't it? I mean, if I give you an example, I mean, I've always said that, for example, local authorities aren't really local authorities; they're agents of central government, because their latitude for making any kind of meaningful decision making is so restricted, it's almost laughable. And certainly, just taking, and I'm sorry, it's a Cornish example. We've handed out, which is simply acting as the agents of central government, £385 million of taxpayers' money into the pockets of second and holiday home owners through the business rating system and COVID aid, as a result of something which I blew the whistle on back in 2012, just over 10 years ago, which was the introduction of a new system whereby a second home owner could switch to describe it as a holiday let, apply for small business rate relief, and then pay nothing at all. That obviously then has to be funded by the central by the taxpayers, and it's the local authorities whose responsibility it is to administer that, and also the local authority who was responsible for administering COVID aid, which went to those who were entitled to small business rate relief. And we've spent twice as much subsidising second home owners and holiday lets as we have put into social housing in Cornwall over that same period of time. Now, I mean, so I would in fact turn the tables on central government and say that actually Cornwall, for example, should be able to say to central government, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to take that money and we're going to put that into social housing. We're not going to put it into second homes, because that is actually inflating the very problem, you know, contributing to the very problem that is causing the enormous, extreme housing problems that exist in Cornwall. So I think the power should be turned the other way around. Not that if not if the locality misbehaves with money, but if the central government give a rather, you know, kind of national template for applying, you know, the implementation of that policy doesn't actually work in an area like ours. In fact, it's extremely damaging. That in fact, actually, that locality should be able to blow the whistle and actually challenge central government and reverse the process.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Torin asks, how can we reform the funding agreements for the Welsh and Scottish parliaments to take into account the varying financial and health needs of those areas? Who would like to respond to that? Suzy?
Yeah, sorry, I can't find the raise hand thing on this. Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier about Barnett formula. I mean, Barnett himself says it's out of date now and needs changing. And I think there's a level of...
3 weeks of introducing it, by the way. You're right, Susan. You're right.
Well, I think everyone has sort of flirted with it in manifestos and then run away from it when they're actually in power. So yeah. I think that would be fair as well. But, you know, there's an understanding that any change should be based on need to a greater extent. But I think that begs a different question then about why certain parts of the UK continue to have the levels of need that they do. And that's kind of what I was referring to a little while back when I said that, you know, all that euro money hasn't really made a huge difference in Wales. So I suppose it's a question of where you start. And I think one of the things that actually the Welsh government was successful with is that it managed to negotiate that Barnett floor, which was a recognition of extra need in Wales, pending somebody else running with it in the future. Now, I suppose this goes back again to the question about how brave should devolved administrations, be they regional or national, how brave should they be with the taxation powers that they do have? And if you think of what Andrew was saying about they would like to use the money that they get to be using that differently from what central government had told them to use it for, you know, that's something we were quite familiar with in Wales, where we get our block grant. It's come from certain pots. There's no compulsion to spend it on those pots that came from the UK, but we are still looking for extra money, potentially through either taxation powers or complaining that we don't get, quite justifiably actually, the manifesto promise that we got back in 2019 for, you know, no loss of funds. Ultimately, it comes down to who should have control of most of the money, and there's a difference between who should raise that and who should spend it. And at that point, I'm going to chicken out from the conversation, because ultimately I just want to finish where I started. We're saying it's time to scrap Barnett and ask those questions about if there is need, why have we still got need, and who should be responsible for fixing need before that becomes a criterion by which we judge in the future how much should come from the central pot. She says confusingly.
No, that's not confusing at all. That's right on. I mean, the fundamental requirement is making needs-related, objectively assessed, needs-related allocations. And the fundamental flaw in the block grant system, God, I made this argument 46 years ago or something, and indeed Joel Barnett made the argument about the same time, though he was Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and I was a rebellious backbencher, so it makes a difference. But the reality is that the needs continue, partly because they are not effectively assessed and the allocations are not spent on exactly what was examined as being required. I'll give it an instance. Morbidity rates, illness rates in Wales are higher than in most of the rest of the UK. I think they're comparable with the northeast of England. And that's one of the major reasons for the chronic pressures on the National Health Service. Now, a devolved government faced with dilemmas of school books or social care or health service expenditure is going to try and meet all those demands. And it means at the margins that more is going to be spent on the school books, as it were, than needs to be spent on dealing with the illness needs. And they are the dilemmas set up by the application of the Barnett formula. What we've got to do, not as an act of centralization, but as an act of objective measurement of requirements, of proven need, is ensure that when a calculation is made and the money is allocated, it's spent in those areas. That's the fundamental reform of the Barnett formula that needs to take place. Obviously, in that has got to be a very effective system of representation and management in order to try to ensure against shortchanging, which has been terribly manifest, particularly in the last 12 or 13 years, with the result that both Scotland and Wales are chronically underfunded, notwithstanding the use of the Barnett formula.
Yeah, can I just add something to that, though, because it relates back to the previous question about prioritisation. Because if you're going to argue that a part of the UK or an individual nation is shortchanged, and I'm not going to say that that's inaccurate, then you would expect the government in charge of spending that to prioritise properly and to focus on those parts of expenditure that relate precisely to those needs. The reason that it was passported across. And I'm not sure that the NAO follows those routes particularly, and that leaves devolved governments with the freedom, but of course they do have under all our settlements, to spend that money on ice cream if they want to.
Yeah.
And there's no sort of reining in and saying, look, you've got a Barnett formula for particular purposes, because that's not accepted by any of the devolved administrations, that it comes with some, I hate the word, philosophical strings rather than moral strings. Yeah.
Well, we are in substantial agreement, because the elephant is in the room and we can tell it's not a mouse. Absolutely right. But the problem is, as you know, Suzy, in the private sector, in the public sector, in family economics, underfunding, shortage of basic resources leads to inefficiency. You can only get real efficiency if you have adequacy of investment or allocation or grant or whatever it is. And if you've got chronic underfunding, and this isn't an excuse for anybody, it's just an arithmetical reality, you will get less efficiency than if you've got adequate funding. That's the problem with the cumulative effect of underfunding.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. But then there's a responsibility on all governments of all flavours not to make that worse.
We've got a question from Jack. Jack asks, Suzy mentioned Scandinavia and the difficulty of becoming like Scandinavia. Does the panel think it's more realistic to pursue a government style closer to Germany? Social market economy, federal democratic republic, fair competition rules, etc. Who would like to respond to that? Yep, Neil, if you like.
I mean, Germany isn't paradise, but it's extraordinary that its constitution and its pattern of governance was determined in the wake of a devastating and cruel war, largely by United Kingdom officials who were trying to plan from the base, recognized the distinctiveness of what are now the lender of the Federal Republic, because they'd always existed as principalities and duchies and countries even within what became Greater Prussia and then the German, the First Reich. And so they recognized that pattern with its comparisons and disparities, its industrial and economic base or agricultural base, its geographical location, the subtleties of language and accent, and they organized West Germany first and now the whole of Germany accordingly. And they recognized too that in order to ensure against domination by the capital and whoever ran it, first of all, the capital was in a near village like Bonn, later, of course, after unification, moved to Berlin. But they also made sure that the Länder had substantial powers over the Länder, over each land, with democratic parliamentary government, with two chambers and representation directly at national level, again in two chambers. And I guess if somebody was given a clean sheet of paper and asked to organize British governance, UK governance now, they'd come up with something like the same answer.
Yeah, I totally. I think that's a perfect answer to that question. We have a question from Jasneet. Is there a situation where any of the panel believe we should raise income tax? What metric would you use to argue that an income tax raise should be justified? Who would like to respond to that?
Well, the first thing to do is tax assets at rates that begin to bear comparison with taxes on income. In fact, if you did that properly, you could probably reduce various bands of income tax. But what's evident in Britain, even though it's an unpleasant political fact, is that because of a constant auction over tax promises, the net result is underinvestment in both physical infrastructure, intellectual infrastructure, and public services. So unless we face up to the reality of having to introduce fair taxation, which includes assets that have soared in value by comparison with incomes in the last 25 or 30 years, no, last 40 years, then we're not going to be able to pay the bills. And nothing is for nothing. Nothing is free. It's got to be paid for.
I mean, I would agree. You know, we need a more progressive approach to taxation, but I think we're going away from the purpose of this discussion. But yeah, if we were having a debate on fair taxation, I would entirely agree with Neil. You know, we do need, if we're trying to kind of break down, you know, the inequalities in our society, then finding a way of taxing wealth, you know, rather than enterprise, you know, would be a far fairer way of proceeding, and of course closing down the massive loopholes, one of which I've mentioned earlier. But of course, as my studies have shown, there are a whole set of kind of industrial sized tax loopholes available to people who are property investors at the moment.
Just to point out, in reference to the last question, it was I've just been clarified to me that it was about devolved taxation rather than just
I see. Right.
generalised raising of income tax. We do have a final question from Colin. Colin asks, is there a case for London's devolution to transform more towards the Scottish model in terms of both political structures of the scope of devolved powers?
Can I
like to respond? Would you like to respond, Suzy?
Oh, right. Sorry, I wasn't sure. Yeah, I was thinking about this question earlier when Andrew was talking, and the role of metro mayors was being discussed. And, you know, a little bit of me inside was saying you can't transfer that model to what's effectively the shires, not least within the sort of kind of Welsh environment. So I don't know. I mean, one of the difficulties we have when we discuss devolution in the UK is that there's so many versions of it, and none of it is equal and none of it is the same. But in the actual sort of trying to turn London into Wales, or I don't know, Scotland into Manchester, or the other way around, I don't see how that works. We're already in a position where trying to impose urban design policies on bits of rural Wales are just causing havoc. And I'm sure that it would be the same the other way around. So the short answer to that is I don't think you can't just transfer one model to another. It has to be designed, as Andrew was talking, it has to come from the bottom. It has to meet a demand. And that requires its own model very often.
Yeah, I think I mean, again, I agree with Suzy. There's also agreement going on here. I think that in the case of London, I don't know. Surely that's for London to determine, isn't it? It's for them to shape, what their future might be, and how it should be governed, and what additional powers. I mean, it's a well-known platitude, if you like, amongst the devolutionists that devolution isn't a single event. It's a process, and that London is engaged or is involved in an ongoing, if you like, process itself, and no doubt as it goes forward, it'll identify which additional powers, which additional capacities it is seeking to acquire in order to improve the way it governs itself. And if it wants to follow some elements of Welsh or Scottish devolution, no doubt it will articulate that.
That's right. I mean, there's a basic rule of organization, or what organization should do, and it is that structure should be a function of purpose. In simple terms, you decide what you need a bit of an organization to do, and then you decide how it should be done. Now, if that attitude was taken to the governance of the United Kingdom, then there would, as Suzy says, be different functions for London and Yorkshire and Wales and Scotland, identifiably so, and you would then have a structure that dealt with it. And so consequently, I mean, we're so far away from that it's almost in the realm of rocket science. And I'm certainly not qualified to give a judgment on that.
We're coming towards the end of the discussion now. I think we have one final question from Rowan, and just because it's quite a long question, just to distill it down to its basics, Rowan is asking, do we think that more devolution could have a negative effect as well as a positive effect, in that it could make the political system seem a bit more complicated, and so perhaps alienate some people who might not be as engaged, with there being more layers of different types of administration and government? Who would like to respond to that?
Well, what we've got isn't working, not only because it's ridiculously and inefficiently over-centralized, but because where there's been departures from centralization, it's incoherent. And so consequently, I think it's quite important to get public understanding and consent for going back to the drawing board. And in my view, there should be a Royal Commission on a written constitution for the United Kingdom, not only because of the decentralization of powers, but of a host of other reasons, like the replacement of the House of Lords and the voting system and God knows what else, the use of analytics in political activity and lots of other things. But, and the day will come when the fragility of our current inadequacy is so demonstrated that there will be a sentiment broadly in favor of looking at change, even in a country that, for good reasons, doesn't like looking at rules and constitutions, even though we invented most of the international sports by drawing up rules. So there's a contradiction there. But one day, the country will want to look at how we are governed, because the way we're governed at the moment is not fit for purpose.
Yeah, I think there's a more human element to this as well, which is whether it's complex or simple. I suppose one of the advantages of the American system is you vote blue or you vote red, and that is it, isn't it, for your president? But there's also very local democracy where you vote for amendments, blah-de-blah, or local constitution for, you know, mowing blades of grass out of verges in a particular street in your local neighbourhood. I think part of what this is that, you know, for the last 100 years or so, having a vote meant that you get someone else to make your decision, kind of abrogate responsibility. You give it to whoever you voted for, and you let them get on with it, and then we just enjoy the pleasure of moaning about the decisions that they made. There's no skin in the game in our voting system, and it's particularly noticeable at local authority level, where actually the delivery of, you know, distant policy has to be done, and where actually the locally made decisions can have the most disadvantage on your daily life. So I don't know if a big constitution would sort that out. I think it's more to do with better political education, little p obviously, in our schools, and raising our young to know that you've got a responsibility to make some decisions.
Yes.
In whether you vote for, not just sticking an X in your favourite box. Sorry.
No, I think that's a great note to end on. I think Torrin would now just like to say a short thank you to everyone to wrap up the session.
Yeah, so thanks everyone for coming along today, and it's been very, very interesting to hear everyone's points of view, and actually for what I must admit was quite an agreeable discussion. I was almost surprised, especially when you put people from Labour, the Lib Dems, and the Conservatives all in the same room. But yeah, so thank you so much. If you want to carry on and listen to this discussion a bit more around this, we will be doing both a short paper summarising this event. We'll also be doing a larger paper at the beginning of next month. I'm sure Patrick will be happy to know also includes some YouGov polling in there. So we'll be doing that, so keep a lookout. But again, thank you so much to everyone for coming today and for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks for your...
Thank you.